Did everybody find a seat? Yes? Sebastian, are we okay? Yes, let's rock and roll. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to tonight's lecture. My name is Barbara Strating. I work as one of the program makers at Studium Generale. And I'm very, very happy that so many of you joined us tonight here in the room. But also everybody who's watching from home. I mean, the weather, and we have a new press conference. So yes, I'm very pleased that many of you are also with us tonight via YouTube. Yes, seats at the back row or here in the front. Yeah, well, this year we at Studium Generale, we work on the theme of the gap. So we organize lectures concerning the gap between rich and poor, high educated, low educated, the Randstad versus Maastricht. And me as a feminist, I thought, well, then maybe we should also talk about the orgasm gap, because that involves at least 50% of our audiences, as long as they are in a heterosexual relationship. So yes, here we are. That's what we are going to talk about tonight. I'm very, very pleased that Marieke Dewitte is here with us. She is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience in the field of sexology. She will talk about that a bit more further on. There are some seats over here. You can take a seat here. So the person who is waiting for you, please wave. Maybe in the top floor? No. But I also want to remember something else, because tonight we would have not just one guest, but two. Ellen van Laan would have been here if it wasn't for her health. She is professor of sexology at University of Amsterdam at the medical center. And she founded the idea of the orgasm gap. I'm not sure if she also found out about the clitoris. Probably did, because the clitoris was founded by scientists in 1989. Just remember, I don't know who of you was born around that year, but ever since women officially have a clitoris. But unfortunately, Ellen can't make it. Marieke will also talk about her research that has been at the core of what we are going to talk about tonight. The lecture will last for 45-50 minutes, and then afterwards we will have some time for questions. Also for the audience at home, please write down the questions in YouTube. I will come back to them afterwards. I will also come over with a microphone. But for now, please give her a warm applause, Marieke Dewitte.
Okay, so good evening. Thank you all for being here. It's really nice to sort of talk to an audience instead of to a black screen and seeing myself all the time. So it's much more inspiring like this. Let's hope we can continue this way. I'm really fed up with the homework and the Zoom meetings. Now, today we're going to talk about the orgasm gap. As Barbara said, I'm a sexologist. I work at the Faculty of Psychology. I do a lot of research on sexuality and mainly looking at sexual arousal in couples, heterosexual couples, non-heterosexual couples. So this theme is also very relevant in terms of my research. But obviously today, I want to spread the word of Ellen Laan. Normally she would have stand here and talked to you about the orgasm gap, which is such an important topic. It's really the core of her research. She's really an expert in a lot of things, on female sexual pleasure in general, gender equality, sexual equality. But unfortunately, she's really sick, so she's not able to come to Maastricht, and we know she will not recover, which is really unfortunate. I really hope she can stay with us a little longer, because we still need to learn so much from her. So I'll do my best to replace her if that is ever possible, and I will try to spread her message and try to spread her words on female sexual pleasure and on the orgasm gap. So, about the topic, what is the orgasm gap? Sounds really nice, okay, but fancy, but what is it? Well, when we look at the research and when we ask people, okay, how many times do you actually reach orgasm during sex? And they did this research in heterosexual women lesbian women, bisexual women, heterosexual men, gay men, bisexual men. And what can we see? Well, about 95% of the men indicate that usually or always they reach orgasm during sex, while only 65% of the women reach orgasm. That's a gap. It's a difference of about 30%. But to make it even worse, when we look at climaxing, reaching orgasm during penetration, then the gap becomes even larger. It's about 90% of men reach orgasm during penetration, while only 30% of women reach orgasm during penetration. Well, that's a large gap, right? So this is what we are going to talk about. And I'll try to explain, okay, what is this about? Why do we have this orgasm gap? And I think one of the most important reasons is that women don't get or seek the right sexual stimulation. So the orgasm gap is actually a pleasure gap. It's also because our sexuality fits the male sexual script. And the male sexual script is mainly about penetration. That's what they found the most interesting, the most amusing part of sexuality. Okay, nothing to say about that. I'll return to that topic. So what is now one of the main reasons why there is an orgasm gap? Because we have a wrong definition of sexuality. We equal sexuality with penetration. It's really strange to see that penetration is still the ideal. Sex means penetration. There's also, it has to do with gender and sexual inequality. And this sexual inequality is caused and maintained by sexual myths. And this is also what I want to do today, is kind of try to debunk these sexual myths. So let's start to debunk these sexual myths. We need to understand how does the sexual system works. Well, first of all, there needs to be a sexual stimulus, something that turns us on. We will pay attention. We automatically, sexual stimuli, they grab our attention. This is something quite automatically, and our body reacts. So we automatically process it. Our body reacts in a certain way. We get an erection, lubrication in women. And so the moment we become aware of these bodily signals, we will further elaborate on this sexual stimulus. We give a certain meaning to it. Is it positive? Do we expect something rewarding? Do we expect something pleasant? And when we expect something pleasant, then we also feel sexually desire. We actually feel sexually aroused. So this is really important. Often we think that desire spontaneously pops up out of the blue. No, that's not what happens. Sexual desire is often the result of arousal. There always needs to be something sexual, a sexual stimulus. We are not always aware of that. It can be a fantasy, a thought. It can be quite unconsciously, quite automatically. Our body reacts, and then sort of the system gets activated. And what is really important is that the sexual system actually works the same in men and women. Like the stimulus, our body reacting, being aware, this circular process, this motivational process is exactly the same in men and women. And this is really important to consider. What is also really important is that we kind of make this difference between our subjective arousal, so how sexually aroused we feel, and our bodily arousal. And this is also important because our body reacts quite automatically. There's a sexual stimulus. Whether it's rewarding or not, it's quite independently of the value of the sexual stimulus. But when we actually start to process the sexual stimulus as something positive, we expect something rewarding, then we feel sexually aroused. And this is important. So the reward value of the sexual stimulus will determine whether or not we will actually engage in this full-blown sexual response. It's really important to consider this because often what happens is that maybe we lack a sexual stimulus. Maybe we don't pay enough attention to it. Maybe we're not quite aware of or not really in sync with our body. Imagine there's a couple didn't have sex for 2 years, you ask about their daily life, and then they talk, well, we get children from school, we cook, we do the wash the dishes, then children go to bed, sit on the couch, we watch TV, we fall asleep, and then stumble to our bed. Okay, where's the sexual stimulus? How can you expect that something sexual will happen in that situation? Maybe there is then a sexual stimulus, one of the partners starts to touch the other partner, but yeah, whether or not, maybe this partner is not noticing it, not paying attention, because it's thinking like, well, tomorrow is Wednesday, I have to get the children from school, or there's music lessons, whatever, so they're not paying attention. Maybe they are paying attention, but they think like, oh no, just leave me alone, I don't want this. And what is this mechanism like, oh no, leave me alone, I don't want this? Because they don't expect something rewarding to happen. And this is really important. So the question is the sexual stimulation people get rewarding enough? And what we often see is that the way we have sex, focusing on this male sexual script and penetration, is not really rewarding for women. So this idea that women have lower desire than men, that's not right. It's just women don't get the right stimulation. It's just not that rewarding as men. And that's the crucial part. That's why we think women have less desire than men. So when we think about sexual desire and arousal, we could make this kind of distinction between the more active sexual desire. I don't like to call it spontaneous desire, because that has this idea that it is something spontaneous. It might feel as a spontaneous thing, but often it's not. It's really, there is a sexual stimulus and then our sexual system gets activated. But what we do see is that the easiness with which the sexual system gets activated is kind of fueled by testosterone. Testosterone sort of fuels this sexual arousability. But then, of course, there's this more responsive sexual desire, the desire by doing it, the motivation to engage in sexuality. There's a sexual stimulus, a partner starts to touch you. At that point, you may feel like, I'm not really into sex at the moment, but maybe it will grow. Let's just see what happens. Give it 10 minutes. Just start to cuddle and kiss and see what happens. This is really important. So that's more this responsive sexual desire. And we used to think, oh, well, men have the more active desire and women are then the more responsive desire. There are no reasons to think in this distinction between differences between men and women. We all have this active and responsive sexual desire. Now, where does this idea come from, like this spontaneous desire? Well, it's the heritage of Freud. In a way, he did fantastic things for psychiatry and for psychology, but he really launched this idea of the libido. Ellen is really not a fan of the term libido, me neither. It's really like, because libido refers to this inner drive, this drive that needs to be released, especially in men. Sex would be like hunger and thirst. So if you don't have sex, you would die. This is obviously not the case. I mean, sex is essential for survival of the species, right, for humankind, but it's not essential for survival of the individual. We don't die if we don't have sex, not even men die. So it's really important to consider this. Actually, if you actually have less sex for a longer period, this lowers your sexual desire because your testosterone levels drop. And that's why we have this idea of use it or lose it, trying to remain sexual activity and remain sexually active is really important also at older age, because it actually sort of gets the machine going. It's really important, this use it or lose it principle. Now, when we are still thinking, okay, we have this idea, well, it's hormones. There are differences between men and women, it's hormones. Well, it's not. Maybe it's evolution. Well, evolution, what is evolutionary theory? There's this idea of parental investment. And because of this parental investment, there would be some differences, that men are more focused on short-term sexuality because they need to spread their genes, they need to reproduce. But for women, there's much more parental investment. There's the pregnancy of 9 months, there's the breastfeeding, there's the raising the child, that costs energy and time. So for them, it's really important to be more selective. So they need to sort of pursue more long-term strategies. And that also what launched this sort of 4-year itch theory of Fisher. At a certain point thought like, okay, when we think about little children, when they come into this world, they're very vulnerable. And so they need care of both parents to survive. So it's actually good for survival if there is kind of a long-term connection between two people. The more vulnerable a child is, or the more attachment becomes important. When we think about species or animals that don't have this vulnerability, like think about a little cow, for example, then attachment is less relevant because it's less functional for survival. But for human children, it's really important to have this kind of long-term commitment. But long-term would be kind of 4 or 5 years, because it takes about 4 or 5 years for a little child to become more or less independent. So a relationship of 4 years would be functional, and then afterwards men can go and spread their genes again, from an evolutionary perspective. So there's kind of this serial monogamy, which then sort of evolved into social monogamy, and a lot of psychologists still refer to that theory to understand why are there differences between men and women. It's our evolutionary makeup. Well, it's not, because these parental investment hypotheses cannot explain differences in male and female behavior, because we actually evolved to live in small communities. And to survive, collaboration was really important. And when we think about collaboration, that means everyone has their own task, but there's equality. So in little communities living together that rely on collaboration, then there is no gender inequality, then there are no differences between men and women. If there are differences between men and women, these are the result of socialization and not the result of evolution or biology. So let's return to this libido idea. We already know, okay, there is not this spontaneous urge that is an inner drive that needs to be released. What is it then? There needs to be a sexual stimulus. It's about the arousability of our sexual system, and it's about the motivation. Am I motivated to open myself for this sexual stimulation? At this point, I might be quite sexually neutral, but let's see what happens. Motivation is a crucial aspect when it comes to sexual desire. And when are you motivated to see what happens? When you expect something rewarding, when you expect something pleasurable to happen. Now, why do we have sex? Well, in the research of Meston and Baz, they discovered that there are about 237 reasons to have sex. Now, we would assume reproduction, obviously, because we need to, that's our heritage, that's the main reason of having sex, to reproduce, to survival. But why would we then have more sex than needed? There was some calculations, Ellen did that once, in which there was like, okay, let's say, meantime, you need about 30 times of penetration before you get pregnant. That's just a mean. And people have about 2 children. So then you need 6 times of penetration during your life. Obviously, we have more sex, or mostly we have more sex than these 60 times. And why would you then continue to be sexual if your child wish is completed? So it's clear that sex is more than reproduction. It's also really about pleasure. Pleasure actually became more important than reproduction. There's intimacy, love, commitment. You want to express your love for your partner. Routine. You just have sex because it's Friday, and every Friday you have sex. Reduction of stress. We see that a lot. Sexuality, because you want to sort of release, relax, busy day. During exam periods, we see it a lot. A lot of students engage in sexuality. Great stress reduction. Social status, instrumental reasons, maid guarding, because you're afraid if I don't give my partner sex, maybe he or she will get it somewhere else, or just a boost of your self-esteem. There are a lot of reasons. I always say, like, you know, there is no bad reason to have sex, even when there's routine sex, because that's part of the relationship and we just have sex every Friday. That's okay. It's okay if it's not the only reason why you have sex. I think the main reason for having sex would be obviously pleasure, but there's not a problem if you have sex for other reasons once in a while. It becomes a problem when you only have sex for a certain reason, a reason that is more fueled by negative emotions or avoiding something negative. So, when we think about sexual stimulus, arousability, hormones, okay, let's think about the sexual arousability. I already indicated this more active desire, which is kind of fueled by testosterone. So what about these hormones? What is the reason? What is the reasoning behind these hormones? Because obviously, hormones could then explain the difference between men and women. if testosterone is so important, well, then it seems logical that men have more sexual desire, right? Well, sexual arousability is the capacity of the sexual system to react at a sexual stimulus. So when there is a sexual stimulus, it's about how easy your sexual system gets activated. And this is somehow indeed influenced by hormones. Now, when we think about hormones, we have they do not influence the sexual response, but they determine how responsive the sexual system is. So what is really important, hormones do not determine our behavior. We do not behave because of the hormones. The hormones just fuel our sexual system. There still needs to be a sexual stimulus. We still need to consider the sexual stimulus to be rewarding and so on. So estrogens, which is like the female sexual hormone, what we often think, has obviously a reproductive function. It has an effect on mood. We know these mood swings depending on the menstrual cycle, which has to do with estrogens. It has an effect on the external features of attractiveness, and it has no direct effect on the sexual system. So it actually prepares the brain and the body for the impact of testosterone. So estrogens have no direct impact on our genital organs. When we think about testosterone, testosterone has a reproductive function. It's sperm production, but in addition, it also has some sexual functions. It facilitates sexual responsivity, facilitates our sexual thoughts and fantasies, nightly genital responses, and we have these quite spontaneous erections or spontaneous lubrication during the night. We all know the morning erection. Also women have wet vagina when they wake up. This is kind of this impact of testosterone. So it influences also the genital sensitivity. So testosterone makes the brain and the genitals ready for sex. So we could say, well, okay, testosterone is kind of has a sexual function, is our sex hormone, but this is also the case in women. Women actually have 4 times more testosterone than estrogens. So why are we constantly talking about estrogens, the female hormones, and testosterone, the male hormones? Because testosterone is also the most important hormone for women when it comes to sexual desire. So it's really important when we think about levels of testosterone, the total testosterone, we have to consider that only 2% is freely available. 98% of testosterone is bound to proteins. So this means that only this 2% of available testosterone can have an impact. And within the normal range of testosterone, then the exact level of testosterone does not really matter. So this is really important to consider. We should not conflate sexual pleasure and reproduction. Hormones have a reproductive function, and then we start to conflate it with sexual functions. Pleasurable and reproductive aspects of human sexuality are conceptually, anatomically, and psychologically distinct. And I think this is really important because we tend to equal sexuality with penetration, which is important to reproduction, and so that's how we think that penetration should then be the most important part of sexuality, because that is what is important for reproduction, so that should be the most pleasurable one, right? Now, when it comes to sexual arousal, really important, okay, our sexual system gets activated, it's our arousability, but there is no button to switch the sexual system on. And sometimes when we think about heterosexual relationships, men still think, well, I'm really in the mood, but she's not really in the mood yet, so let's switch the button on. Let's just start to touch the genitals or the clitoris or the nipples, and let's sort of, there's like an on button, and then the sexual system of the woman is on. It does not work, because if you're not aroused enough, it's really annoying when you start to stimulate the clitoris and the nipples. So erogenous zones do not exist. Try to explore the total body. Do not only focus on the clitoris or the nipples. Tune your sexual arousal toward each other. If you notice, well, my partner isn't in the mood yet, take some time to get at the same level of sexual arousal. And I think this is also really important, because what often happens is that women engage in penetration when they're not aroused enough. And what happens then? It hurts. A lot of women have pain during intercourse. And pain is actually a signal that your body is not ready yet for penetration. And that's really important to consider. Pain is often the result of unaroused intercourse. So don't start to engage in penetration when you're not aroused yet, because you're not lubricating enough. Maybe you're kind of squeezing your pelvic floor a little bit because you're quite tense, you're not relaxed yet. So what happens is then you have a dry, narrow vagina. So the moment you penetrate, this actually hurts. It causes mechanical friction. And so then you get into this vicious circle. So this is really important to consider. And there's a kind of a problem with our anatomy, because in women, we're able to continue with penetration even when we're not aroused. When we think about men, when men are not aroused, they lose their erection. Then there's no penetration possible anymore. But when women are not aroused, they are still able to penetrate or to allow penetration. And that's a big mistake of our biology, is that is still possible. And that's one of the reasons why so many women actually have pain, because they allow penetration the moment they're actually not aroused yet, or not aroused enough. So important, women and men are, in principle, equally arousable, provided that they are stimulated in a way that fits their genital design, and that they have the opportunity to learn that sexual activity can be sexually rewarding. This is an important quote of Ellen van Laan. Really important to consider this. When you want to have pleasurable sex, when you want to be aroused and have desire, you need to make sure that the stimulation you get is right and that it's sexually rewarding, that you expect something pleasant. So let's then think about this orgasm, which is obviously a very rewarding part of sexuality. Now, men tend to prefer penetration when it comes to orgasm. It's kind of the most stimulating, or for a lot of men, one of the most stimulating parts of sexuality. Women actually need stimulation of the clitoris. This is really important. Now, the clitoris, and this is a picture of the clitoris, which we know indeed since 1998, very late. The clitoris is not that little knot that we see on the outside. The clitoris is actually a clitoral complex, an organ, and it's located deep into the vagina. It has a lot of nerves. It also gets swollen when we get sexually aroused. So it's really important to consider that the clitoris is really more than this little button. So the moment you actually penetrate, what happens then when you're sexually aroused enough, then this clitoral complex is swollen, so then you are actually stimulating indirectly the clitoris. You're stimulating the back of the clitoris, and this is what actually happens during penetration. So, important, the vaginal orgasm does not exist. It's always a clitoral orgasm. It's also part of the heritage of Freud, who kind of made this distinction between vaginal and clitoral orgasm and indicated that the only mature orgasm is the vaginal orgasm, which is obviously bullshit because it's always a clitoral orgasm. It's actually really important to consider why is the clitoris so important, and I'm really happy that finally this picture of the clitoris has made it into the biology books only this year, which is remarkable, 2021, and finally we have a proper image of the clitoris. But the thing is, our vagina is not our sex organ, our clitoris is our sex organ, and this is really important because it's obvious. I mean, the vagina is the birth channel. This is always what Ellen really stresses during her lectures. The vagina is a birth channel, so it's very good that it's not that sensitive, because otherwise people wouldn't have children anymore if it would be that sensitive. So, I mean, it's stimulation of the clitoris. That's the most important part. Only men can have vaginal orgasms when they reach orgasm during penetration, during vaginal penetration. The vagina is a birth channel. The clitoris is our sex organ, and what men have on the outside, women have on the inside. Like a penis that gets swollen, so also our clitoral organ will get swollen. And we kind of forget this. We know everything about the penis and how it works, but we actually don't really know how our female sex organs work. So it's time to educate us a little bit more about the importance of the clitoris. So, penetration. Right, can be very stimulating, can be really fun, at least when you include clitoral stimulation. It's really important, as we said in the beginning of the presentation, only 30% of women reach orgasm during penetration. So if you want to reach orgasm during penetration, use your fingers. Use a little vibrator, something that you can use during penetration or maybe before or after penetration. It's really important because we kind of need this extra stimulation to reach orgasm. Now, men don't feel intimidated by these big vibrators and you think, oh, well, if there's a vibrator, what is my role then? Women still want to make love. It's much more than only reaching orgasm during penetration, obviously. But we do see in terms of research, it has been shown that using the fingers is actually more efficient when it comes to reaching orgasm than the penis. So the biggest problem is that we just kind of define sexuality as penetration, and the problem is also that we define satisfying sex as climaxing. And especially men tend to do this. If you ask about, well, you were fooling around with your partner, having some genital touching, oral sex and whatever, and then you ask afterwards, did you have sex with your partner? Women may say yes, men may say no, because there was no penetration, so it's not real sex. Imagine that you're fooling around and you didn't reach an orgasm, then obviously it's not sex for men, because it seems that sex needs to result in a climax. Now, because of this focus on this orgasm, a lot of women also feel pressured to reach orgasm. And it's obviously often what we see is that men have this idea that sex can only be good when there is an orgasm. So when you penetrate or you're engaging in sexuality and your female partner is not climaxing, men start to feel insecure. A lot of women sort of don't want their partner to feel insecure and then start to fake orgasm because they know, well, this orgasm is so important. Now, it does not mean that women don't consider orgasm as important. There's this stereotypical belief that men are all about sex and orgasm and women are all about intimacy. I mean, men also like intimacy and women also want to climax. It's rewarding, right? If you have sex and then you can climax, obviously that's one of the most rewarding parts of sexuality. But what often happens is that because it's more difficult to reach orgasm, women sort of tell themselves it's not important. We often have this idea, well, the orgasm is not important for women, but it might be the result of cognitive dissonance, is that we sort of adjust our thoughts to our behavior. It's more difficult to reach orgasm, so to reduce the stress, I just tell myself it's not important. But it actually is. Climaxing is important. Does not mean that sex should always be about climaxing and orgasm. That's not what I'm saying. But we should sort of leave this idea that the orgasm is not important for women and that it's only important for men. When we think about a sexual script, like how often heterosexual couples engage in sexuality, when we think about the foreplay, what happens there? There's some genital touching, kissing, touching, oral sex, using fingers. A lot of women will climax during foreplay. It's the most rewarding part. It's what actually stimulates them. But then there needs to be penetration, because that's the main course. The foreplay is only the appetizer. You want a main course, right? Now the thing is, we should think about it differently. The foreplay is the main course. Penetration is dessert. Sometimes you want this little extra, sometimes you already had enough with your appetizer. So it's really important to sort of keep our focus a little bit away from penetration needs to be part of any sexual event. There's much more than penetration when it comes to sexuality. So when it comes to this orgasm, the question is really important. What do I need to get sexually aroused? It's one of the questions we ask to our clients. If women have problems with desire, arousal, orgasm, we ask, what do you need to feel desire? What do you need to get sexually aroused? Do you know what you need? Yes, I do know what I need. Tell me, what? Well, a lot of women don't know that. So what is the main thing we need to do? We need to explore. Look at porn. write sexual erotic scripts. There are a lot of erotic podcasts nowadays, really interesting. Sort of explore which type of stimulation you actually like. You can get inspiration from several parts. Self-stimulation, really important, is masturbation. Using vibrators, fingers, because sometimes it's easier to let go when you're on your own, that you can really focus on your own sexual sensations. The moment you masturbate and you can climax during masturbation, then you learn to recognize the signals that prepare yourself for the orgasm. So that will make it also easier to reach an orgasm during sex with the partner, because you already recognize these signals that sort of signal this orgasm is coming. So self-stimulation is really important to learn to understand your own sexual arousal. It's broadening your sexual script, but it's also often renewing your sexual script. We often write this kind of script, like sort of this fixed pattern of how we engage in sexuality becomes very efficient. At a certain point you know the buttons and you immediately do this because you know this is what my partner needs to climax. Well, after 10 years it can be less exciting to always follow these same steps, and what has been exciting in the beginning of your relationship might not be exciting anymore after 10 years. So sometimes you just need to renew your sexual script and look for stimulation that is rewarding enough. There are no good and bad lovers, and this is also important because sometimes women consult and say, well, you know, I have difficulties with reaching orgasm, but my partner isn't really good at it. My ex-partner was great when it came to oral sex, but my current partner isn't really getting me there. And then you need to ask yourself, okay, what was so exciting? What did your ex-partner exactly do that made you reach orgasm? Well, he touched me in this way, or he used his tongue in this way, and he made circles, and my current partner was always sucking my clitoris. I don't like that. Well, if you don't like that, then you need to communicate that to your partner. It's really important. Communication is key. First of all, you need to know, what do I need to get sexually aroused and to reach orgasm? And then tell your partner. Your partner will really like it. He's also trying something. He does not know what he's doing. So instruct each other a little bit. Be open in your communication, because that is the key of sexuality. Getting the right stimulation in a safe context in which you can explore your own sexuality, in which you can communicate to your partner, what do I like, what do I don't like. This is really important. So orgasm is also part of your own responsibility. If you want to reach orgasm, seek for the right stimulation and communicate about it with your partner. Now, if it's then not biology, I think it's quite clear in my case we cannot explain differences or orgasm gaps because of hormones, because of our evolutionary background, because of how our sexual system works, because we're quite similar in that. We cannot explain differences. So, but there is this orgasm gap. So if we cannot explain it by referring to biology and hormones, how can we then explain it? Well, probably a big issue is socialization. Women tend to, or are socialized to please others. That's often what we do. We kind of please our partner. So we put actually the pleasure of our partner above our own pleasure. The pleasure of the partner, oh, if he climaxes, if he is satisfied, that's the most important part. This is really a big issue. Our own sexual pleasure should be at least as important as the sexual pleasure of your partner. It's also the sex education. It kind of disregards pleasure. Because if we think, what is the main focus of sex education? It's about diseases, it's about making sure that you're protected. It's a lot of negative messages, and it's also implicit messages that sex is penetration, because you need to put a condom on, you need to make sure that you don't get an STI, that you don't get pregnant. So implicitly it's about, when you have sex, that means penetration, so you need to protect yourself. So it's an implicit message that we're focusing on the consequences of an orgasm via penetration, while sex education should be much more about the clitoris. How does it look like? How can we stimulate ourselves? Values, consent, sex in a relationship. So we still have a long way to go to make sex education more inclusive and more diverse and more what young people actually need to know about sexuality. Also a big issue here when it comes to explaining differences between men and women is that men often have much more experience with their genitals than women. Because they have external genitalia, they start to play quite when they are younger, they already start to play with their genitals. They need to touch their penis when they pee. So they have actually a lot of experience. For women, our genitals are less visible, so we have less experience with it. So we actually need even more, the sex education becomes even more important for women to actually educate us. So like, okay, what should we actually do to stimulate ourselves? Because we have less experience. So it's really important. The slut-shaming phenomenon. Women still are kind of learn to inhibit their sexual expression. If as a woman you're openly talking about how much sex you desire and how much you masturbate, it's still kind of frowned upon when we compare it with men. It's quite normal. When you're 12, 13 years, you start to masturbate. Men are really open about it. They brag about it. Women are kind of still a little bit ashamed about it. And that's because of this slut-shaming. There's still a double standard when it comes to male sexual behavior and female sexual behavior. And that is really the result of our social processes. Really important, and also one of the key messages of Ellen: teach women to say yes to sex. We always teach women to say no. We need to protect ourselves. Men are testosterone bombs. They cannot help it. They just need to transgress. That's what they do. They need to pursue. And then women need to keep the guard. It's our task to say no. Why? If we always need to protect ourselves and say no to sexuality, then we don't explore our sexuality. Then we cannot freely enjoy our sexuality or engage in sexual pleasure. So learning to say yes to sexuality, and it's educating the boys, making sure that they respect values and consent, that they don't transgress. Women should not be afraid of men when walking on the street. We should make sure that we educate the boys in the right way, to act in the right way. The sexual violence still is the problem, that women are much more victim of sexual violence than men, which has to do with still existing gender equality, which is a bigger societal problem that we still need to handle. And when it comes to these differences that we think there are between men and women, meta-analyses have shown that these differences are really minimal. There's much more overlap than differences. So we actually should stop looking for differences. We always, when we do research, one of the most famous titles in sex research is Gender Differences in. Why? Why are we always assuming a difference? Why do we make a hypothesis about differences, and why are we not focusing on similarities and overlap? Because these differences are really small. And if you look for differences, you will find differences. So let's start focusing a little bit more on similarities and overlap between men and women. So any tips? If we now talk about sexual desire, sexual arousal, arousability, orgasm gap, what can we then do to actually reduce the gap between men and women? First of all, increasing our sexual desire or sexual arousal and our ability to reach orgasm by making sex more rewarding. Making sure that we have sex in a way that actually fits our genitals and that actually makes us longing and desiring for something. So relaxing, focusing on what you feel. Explore the sexual stimuli that work for you. So let's broaden our sexual script. It's not only about male penetration, there's much more to sexuality. Communicate what do you like, what you don't like, and make sure that you have an open conversation with your partner. Really important, if you're not aroused, then don't start with penetration, because penetration will hurt if you're not aroused enough. I cannot repeat that enough. It's one of my main topics in my research is female genital pain. There are a lot of women suffering from it. We try to understand the underlying dynamics, and it seems to be a lot about this unaroused intercourse. Gender equality, sexual equality should be the norm, not doing gender. We often do gender. Gender is not a biological construct, it's a social construct. Men and women behave in a way based on what is expected to behave. It's the role of our society that actually prescribes how men and women should behave. So this is really important. Stop doing gender. Men and women do not differ in their capacity for sexual pleasure, but in the opportunities for sexual pleasure. Really let this sink in. So there is no difference in sexual pleasure, it's just that we need to create the right circumstances, the right stimulation to make sex pleasurable and rewarding. Sexual pleasure is a cornerstone of sexual health. Actually, in 2020, only 1 year ago, the World Association of Sexology accepted this as an important part of sexual health. So it's clear that sexual health, sexual rights, and sexual pleasure are interrelated concepts. So we really need to focus on these three. Sex has a lot of health and relationship benefits, so it's important to study sexuality. So let's end and conclude with the most important message of today. It's we need a new definition of sexuality. And according to Ellen van Laan, the definition of sexuality is not penetration, but it's about sexually pleasurable experiences among equals. Thank you. And thank you, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Marieke Dewitte. We now have some time left for questions. I can imagine that you might have questions, although it was a really, the story almost answered all of mine questions. But if you have a question right now, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I will open the floor with some improvised questions. And also, if you are with us via YouTube, you can write down the question in the chat. I have my device here with me, and I will read out your questions out loud. First, this is something that was quite new to me, but why wasn't sexual pleasure part of sexual health? This seems, yeah.
Sexual health was really always about the absence of disease. That's how we define sexual health. So you're healthy when there is no sexual dysfunction, when you have a sexual system that works, when you get an erection, when you're lubricating, when you reach orgasm, then you're sexually healthy, or when there's no medical disease. But we didn't really focus on pleasure. Your system can work. I can be lubricating, but if you don't feel sexually aroused, and don't have pleasure, that's the most important part. And there's also one part, if we think about this distinction between subjective arousal and genital arousal, sometimes people have the tendency to consider genital arousal as the objective marker. Because if we think, the research we also do in Maastricht is we invite people to come to the lab, they watch pornographic movies, we measure their genital arousal, we have devices for that, and then also we measure their subjective arousal. And then what we often see in a lab situation is that women, their body reacts to the pornographic movie, but they don't feel sexually aroused. So we have a quite flat line, but we do see and then sometimes people say, well, they are aroused because their body reacts. But then it's like, yeah, sexual arousal just contains two components. It's subjective arousal and genital arousal. And you could say, well, when your body reacts but you don't feel aroused, what's the fun about it? I think that subjective arousal, your mental component, is much more important than your genital arousal. It's not an objective marker or the true sexual arousal. Your subjective arousal, your meaning you give to sexuality, the pleasure, that's the most important part of sexuality.
Then talking about genital arousal, because I also read in my research for this program that Ellen van Laan also really strongly advocates that women who are raped should know that sexual arousal is actually part of
it's
what's
a quite
happening.
automatic
Maybe you can
response.
Explain that a bit more, because to me that was really quite puzzling.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like I explained in the sexual system, there's a sexual stimulus, we automatically grabs our attention, and our body actually quite automatically react independently if we value that as something positive or not. So what happens during rape, there's a sexual stimulus, it's sexual, so our body reacts. A lot of women will lubricate during rape, or some women actually reach orgasm during rape. Obviously, they're not aroused mentally. It has no positive associations. So that clearly, indeed, marks the difference between genital arousal and subjective arousal. And sometimes rapists actually sort of use this argument. You know, she was wet, so she enjoyed it. Obviously not. Your body is really not saying anything about the pleasure part. That's really, or actually, our most important sex organ is actually our brain and not our body.
Are there any questions? Please raise your hand. Yes. Also, if you have a question on the top floor, I can't reach you with my microphone, so please come down, come over here, and I will hand you the microphone. And for now...
There's also a question here in front, I think. Yeah.
I mean, we are all about STDs tonight, but we're also about COVID.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting. You briefly mentioned pornography, and I was just wondering what's your personal opinion about this, because I know it's kind of controversial that it's very often geared towards male pleasure, and that it also kind of creates these kind of toxic trends of like, okay, this is what it is expected from sex, when perhaps it's, you know, you don't need to have all this kinky sex to reach orgasm or to, you know, have the sexual pleasure.
It's quite like, I think for when it comes to pornography, I think it's really important to have a nuanced idea. I mean, for a long time, we always, again, assume it's negative. It has a negative impact on sexual development. And we do see that, indeed, women are objectified. There's like more permissive attitudes regarding violence. There should be like boys that watch pornography a lot sort of endorse rape myths and so on. There's research investigating that. But on the other hand, I think pornography can also have a positive function in the sense that it gives you inspiration. We actually use it a lot in therapy for couples to get inspiration to broaden their sexual script. So in a way, if you use it in the right way, I mean, it does not mean, okay, now you need to watch pornography. Maybe you feel like, I'm not really into it. Okay, but just at least explore it. And I think what is really important, there are different types of pornography. Luckily, we have much more female-friendly porn, and this is also what we see in the lab, that if we use the more mainstream pornography which is oriented towards men, the blowjob and really what men like, while the female-friendly porn is much more about the pleasure of the women, which is also more central and more an equal message. And that's also really important that to say, well, you know, there are different types of pornography, so explore what you like the most. There is indeed a risk that young people, they don't have experience with sexuality, so then they watch porn and they think, okay, this is what sex is about. So a lot of men climax come, ejaculate in the face or on the belly because that's what they see in a pornographic movie, and they think this is normal because they don't have another example. So it's quite, so it can have the risk that you sort of miseducate young people about what sex is about. So that's why I think it's also so important in sex education to target this sex education at school, but also parents. I think parents have a really important role to talk about sexuality with their children, because they need to sort of give this reality check to make people sure, like, okay, this is what sex is about. And we cannot just simply erase the fact that there is porn. I mean, there is a lot of porn, so it's really not prohibiting it, but it's really learning to handle it and learning to understand, you know, like you watch a Disney movie, that's also how you should sort of look at porn. It's not reality, not always, but you can get elements of it and get inspiration. I think with all this new technology going on, with sexting and all these different types of communication, we're always very much in this protective mode. Ooh, what is the bad impact? I think we cannot think it away. It's part of our society. So it's really about learning to deal with it. I think that's the most important part. Yeah.
Are there further questions? Yes, I will join you. Also, while I'm walking, I'm just wondering, who learned something new today? The majority, actually.
Which is a good thing, but on the other hand, also a bad thing, because you should know this. This should be basic knowledge.
While you were talking, I was just wondering, why is this research even groundbreaking? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Why should female pleasure be...
This should be actually part of sex education. And I teach this course in the third year psychology program. And I always have students afterwards coming to me like, I learned so much. And then I'm thinking, this is third year psychology. You're almost 20 years. And now you learn new things about sexuality. This should be sex education when you're 12 and actually even earlier, because sex starts much earlier.
Yes, thank you for this talk. In the lecture, you mentioned that there is no such thing as a vaginal orgasm because it's still indirect clitoral stimulation. But a lot of people claim the existence of the G-spot, and also some people with vaginas also say that they can reach ejaculation through vaginal penetration, and a lot of anecdotal reports say that it also feels different from clitoral stimulation. And I know it's still quite debated, but I was wondering what your stance on
I
this.
think what you say, very debated. I think what we think about the G-spot, I mean, you can give it a name. If you want to give it a name, it's just the back of the clitoris. So we think about the clitoris is about 5-6 centimeters above the vaginal opening. So if you think where is the G-spot, also about 5-6 centimeters if you insert the vagina.
Had a picture, right, about the clitoris?
Yeah. Then I need to go back. How do I do this again? Or I can...
No
No problem.
things up, but because it's really a beautiful picture, and I think it wasn't in my biology book when I went to high school.
It's actually only...
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, here it is. Oh, no, I need to go back again. Yeah. Okay, and now I need to press, but if I press it... Don't know how I actually... New technology. But you see the picture, right? Now, the thing is, this is really important to see this. Indeed, what happens if you sort of... go into the vaginal opening on about 5-6 centimeters, you actually are exactly at the center where the most sensitive part of the clitoris is. So this is what you actually feel when you penetrate. You're simulating the back of the clitoris. And some people say, well, there's a special spot. It's more like when you make, I don't know how to say it in English, but it's the kom-kom beweging. So you do like, if you insert and you do this is what happens. Then you are stimulating the back of the clitoris. And so this is what we then call the G-spot. So at a certain point, it's like, oh, there's a special place in the vagina. Yes, indeed, it's a special place. It's there where there's the most sensitive nerve density of the clitoris. But that's what it is. And does it feel differently? Yeah, obviously, because if the rest of the vagina is less sensitive, then that part is more sensitive. And it also depends on position, like which position you use, how you sort of position yourself, whether or not you're stimulating this part. So that's why in certain positions, women can more easily or enjoy sexuality more during penetration, because in certain positions you're actually stimulating that part of the clitoris more. It's also you can also in certain positions kind of stimulate the outside of the clitoris, the little knot. So it's really about positioning, using attributes, using fingers, trying out a way to stimulate your clitoris from the outside and from the inside.
Any further questions? Yes.
If a man wants to stimulate the clitoris, he has to penetrate the vagina with his finger?
That's the most efficient part. I mean, you can also stimulate it via penetration. So and that's also something what a lot of men are concerned about. Oh, my penis is not long enough to satisfy my partner. And then I always say to these men, if you think that the most sensitive part is about 5-6 centimeters, most men will reach 5-6 centimeters. So it's really... You can use via penetration, but as I said, only 30% of women will actually climax during vaginal penetration. It also depends on how much nerves you have, how sensitive you are. But the most easy way, like the most efficient way, what we know also from research, is that using the fingers is actually more efficient than using the fingers, because you can make this bow, this sort of,
But can you stimulate it also from the outside, the side parts?
The side parts, no, that's really located across the vaginal. So you have the outside part of the clitoris, the little knot, and then you have the inside part. And it's via penetration, you know that this clitoral organ gets swollen, sort of surrounds the vaginal opening, so you stimulate that part. And that's why it's also so important that you're aroused enough so to have this swollen clitoral organ to make it actually stimulating.
But can you feel the side parts from outside as a man?
I think if you in a way, if you sort of stimulate that first part that surrounds the vaginal opening, then you will sort of stimulate the woman also, yeah.
Other questions? Wow, many questions. It's great. Let's start here then. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask, I know that, I'm not sure, if anal orgasms exist, because in men, it's very common in the journals that they say because of the prostate.
There are also sensitive
they happen,
parts, yeah. I mean,
but are they true for women too, or?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to biological makeup, we know that men and women are very much alike. So the sensitivities we have in the male anus, we also have the same in the female anus. Yeah. So it really depends on the way you are stimulating, whether you can sort of actually have a stimulating. But if you then call it an anal orgasm, it's just kind of. It's also like an orgasm is also something that happens in your brain, right? To have this rewarding point of climaxing, it's not only a physical process, it's also like the meaning you give to it. Like this is really like how do you say it? Hoogtepunt, this climax actually. So it's also part of how you experience it. Yeah.
Orgasm is more of a
no, there are clearly sensitive. No, it's not only the brain. It's always a combination of stimulation of what you feel, and it's also about the combination of the meaning you give to it. That's always what an orgasm is about. Yeah. But there are sensitive parts there.
I will be with you, sir, in a couple of minutes, but I have multiple questions in the chat and I don't want to neglect them. First off, there's a question that Ellen van Laan sometimes mentions that the clitoris can become erect, like a penis.
Yeah.
Is that also a way to bridge the gap, that we both call it an erect genital?
Yeah, I think it's also important to consider if we think about our biology, like if we start in the womb, we always start from a female plan actually. Our genitals are female, and then because of the impact of testosterone, after 6 to 8 weeks, the clitoris grows into a penis. So we always start with a clitoris, and that grows into a penis. So the glans of the clitoris is the glans of the penis. This clitoral organ is actually the same what happens as erectile tissue, what we have in the penis of the man. So that's why, again, purely anatomically, what men have on the outside, women have on the inside. It's just flipped around. It's just in a different constellation, but it's the same tissue. So that's really important, yeah.
Okay, and then the second question I found really interesting, also a question of myself. How come that the clitoris was discovered that late? I mean, it has been there always.
Yeah, because in a way, female sexual pleasure or orgasm in women is not functional for reproduction. And I think that's a little bit the thing. Sex has been studied by biologists, and biologists are interested in the reproductive function, the biological function of the sexual system. So obviously we need to understand the penis and the erection and ejaculation. What if there's a problem with ejaculation? Because then you cannot reproduce. But like this clitoris, what is the function? What is the function of a male orgasm? Yeah, reproduction. What is the function of a female orgasm? So, and that is one of the reasons why we have been focusing so much on male sexuality instead of female sexuality.
Excuse me, when was the clitoris discovered, you said?
The clitoris discovered in the sense like that it's a clitoral organ in 1998. So there was like an MRI scan, and then they discovered, you know, the clitoris is more than this little knot. Obviously, we already knew that the clitoris existed.
Like this
picture, like how it's really this clitoral organ was like late 90s, and actually now it only is now that it's in the biology books that really people learn about how the clitoris look like. Because if you show a clitoris, if you ask women to draw a clitoris, a lot of women will just draw a little knot. But this is how the clitoris looks like.
That's true. This picture was indeed, I saw it
on the news. It was on one of the news items.
I want to thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. It should be interesting for everybody. But at the same time, I'm a bit disappointed. Maybe it's my age, but I think it's my opinion that every man who is interested in the well-being of her partner, of his partner, he should know all these things already before.
Yeah.
I mean, I was studying in the 70s, and in the 70s I was reading the sheer height report already. So in my opinion, every man should know this.
I think
And
that's the ideal, but the reality is that a lot of men
No,
still don't know.
That's why this lecture is important. And also, the main part of the audience is female. That
Well, there are quite some men.
yeah, some, but I think that's also a signal that men should be more interested in these things.
Yeah. But we can spread the word, right? You will all tell your friends and your partners. You can watch it on YouTube, so let's make sure that we all educate each other better. Yeah.
Another question is, in my time we didn't have internet yet, so we had to find out ourselves just by asking your partner what's pleasant for you, and you can read a lot about that. Nowadays I'm a bit worried about young people see on the internet they can find everything, and also about perversity, SBM, SBDM, DSM, all those fantasies. And I'm a bit worried that they are starting early with these things, and then sometimes I think,
Well, there is a
what you will do when you get 30 or 40, there's nothing to discover anymore.
No, but there's always this worry about the pornification of society, and there's so much, and it's a worry. But when we look at research, and there's a constant monitor looking at sexual development and sexual behavior in young children and in adolescents, and there's no change in like the first age at which young people have first intercourse. There's also no change in what we call the sexual interaction career. Often it takes about 2-3 years before the first kiss, the first French kiss, and then the penetration. And that is stable across years. So even when there's so many developments going on in our society, we still see that adolescents adhere to this sexual career, that the mean age is still about 15, 16 years old for the first sexual intercourse, and that didn't change even when there is much more. But we do have to make sure that indeed sex education becomes much more important nowadays, because there's so much misinformation that we need to make sure that, and that's really important. What I always say to parents, don't make it the task of school or of organization. It's also part of your task to talk with children about sexuality, and don't wait until they're 12, because children are acting sexual way earlier. There's a lot of masturbation going on when they're 3-4 years old. Obviously, it does not have a sexual meaning for children, because they just do something that is pleasurable, and what is pleasurable you want to repeat. But yeah, I think at that point, children are exploring their body. They're asking a lot of questions about, hey, what is the difference between men and women? They ask questions about sexuality. Give an answer, appropriate to their age, obviously, but always give an answer, because it's so important, because at that point, children learn, okay, this is a theme that I can discuss with my parents. And then when they have questions about sexuality, they will be more open to talk with you about sex. And then it becomes really important, because then as a parent you can do these reality checks and learn your children what sex is about.
I have maybe a comment and a follow-up question. So like pleasure, like also how it framed here, is often kind of like put into an individual's frame. However, like you have in a partnered sex, like it's not only about like the communication, like how you communicate it, but if you think also for example, trauma-informed sex, that the other person or like the other persons should reach out to you as well as, for example, the bigger picture, like the economical structure has influence on you as well. For example, during like Soviet Union, there was research when they reunited Germany in Eastern Germany, more women had actually pleasureful sex than women in Western Germany. So that kind of like is reflected there. And I was wondering, how is that reflected then in research?
Well, you mean that like there are differences? Like there's a lot of theories about. Indeed, I also know this example about like in Eastern Germany, women had more orgasms than in Western Germany. It has to do with the economical system in the sense of when you are in societies that rely on collaboration, which I also mentioned, and when like there's a more communistic idea, then the idea would be that there's much less gaps between men and women because they need to collaborate and they need to provide each of them, and each has their role. So that would then have a positive impact on sexuality. So it's clear that economical issues, societal issues and I think if we think about sexuality and how we define sexuality, it's really by definition biopsychosocial. It's about how our body reacts, it's our psychological makeup, and there's a really big impact of socialization, what we hear in the media, all the messages we get, how our economical structure, how our social structure is made up. It really has a big difference on how we experience sexuality. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, by the way. Have you done research on heterosexual couples who use toys, and does that bring the orgasm gap down?
I don't know. I'm not. There probably is research. I didn't do it myself, but I think obviously that when you use toys that help to give you the right stimulation, then I would assume that there's probably a smaller orgasm gap, because I think it's also important that if you use a vibrator, we always think, oh, that's the female pleasure, but it's also very stimulating for men if you use a vibrator. The vibration, actually, what we also often use when men have erectile dysfunction, if you put a vibrator on the glands, it can be very stimulating for men as well. So that's why I always say, like, integrate this into your sex play. I mean, it's not that we all need to be very acrobatic and use different positions and all toys and so on. It's not the norm. It should, I mean, I think it's also the pleasure imperative. We should not make sexual pleasure as, you know, something that it becomes a pressure. I think it's also what I always also say to people is the good enough sex is also good enough. I mean, sex is great and can be passionate, and it's really important to seek for sexual pleasure, but sometimes your sex was like, okay, and that's okay. Obviously, it's a problem when it's also always just okay. We can really look for stimulation, and then you can use sex toys, you can use things, just explore. I think it's really about exploring. Some people might like it, some people might not like it, but what we do see indeed, when you give vibration, when you use vibration, it gives a very intense stimulation to the clitoris, and we do know that a lot of women will more easily reach orgasm when using a vibrator. Yeah, but integrate it, use it in heterosexual couples. Men can benefit from it as well.
We have a question on the chat online. I think it's one that is part of the education part of tonight. What happens when you climax as a woman, when you experience contractions? Why are you contracting during climax?
That's actually what climax, from the biological process, the pelvic floor starts to in rhythmic way starts to I'm losing the English word, samentrekken, contract, yeah, obviously. So it's just, you have rhythmic contractions of the pelvic floor from the uterus, and this is actually kind of a biological process. So actually the pelvic floor is a really important, that's a whole lecture in itself. I think we should really devote a lecture on the pelvic floor, because it's something we don't know. I mean, a lot of people don't really know, but the pelvic floor is really involved in sexuality. I mean, remember the example I gave about female genital pain, that one of the main mechanisms in female genital pain is lower lubrication, but also squeezing your pelvic floor. This pelvic floor hypertonicity, like overactive pelvic floor, can be one of the mechanisms underlying female genital pain. But also when it comes to climaxing, the pelvic floor plays an important role, and that's why in a lot of therapies also, like with premature ejaculation in men, erectile dysfunction, but also in female dysfunctions, pelvic floor physiotherapy is an important part of the treatment, because it does play a role, and these rhythmic contractions are kind of part of the biological process. Yeah.
I made a note. We will do a second lecture
on the pelvic floor.
Yeah. Any further questions in the audience? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's good that we talk so much about socialization and education. And I was wondering, we already touched upon pornography, but I was wondering if there's research about the impact of artistic media, like cinema or even music. I think how we see how music becomes much more explicit in its lyrics, like does that also
Interesting, actually. I'm not aware. There's probably is, but I mean, that's also one of the things about sexology. When it comes to sexuality, it's so the literature is scattered across disciplines. It's really difficult to get keep track of all the literature and all the research that is going on about sexuality. But it might be, and it's really interesting to explore that. I don't know actually at this point. I cannot give you a clear answer on your question.
I think we are about to finish this evening, but I will ask one question, and meanwhile you can think if there is a final question that you would like to ask, and then I will give you the microphone. But when it comes to arousal, but also to educate ourselves, do you have any advice on books or podcasts that you
oh my God, yes. It's a great, I hear giggling, so probably some know. I think that's really an interesting site because it's quite explicit actually on actually how you can stimulate yourself, really educating like the exact steps. It's not just, hey, you should stimulate yourself and use a vibrator. Yeah, but how? Hey, you should use your fingers. How? They explain it actually at that website. So it's a really great website. Oh my God, yes. There's shespot.nl. There you also have more like erotic stories. And there are some podcasts. If you look for erotic podcasts on Spotify, because it's only, I think it's important, you have the visual stimulation, but also auditory stimulation, just having a story, because sex is also partly about fantasy and sort of making your own story. So stimulating yourself while you're listening to erotic podcasts can also be very exciting. But it's really important to sort of explore yourself and start by touching. Start with taking a mirror and watch your clitoris, watch how you look. A lot of women don't know how they actually look like. So I think that's also important. Just take a mirror, watch, use your fingers, use some lubricant or some liquid or something, and try to sort of touch yourself and explore what is exciting for you.
And books like Come As You Are or any other?
Yeah. I think it really is very individually determined what people like. I mean, some people really like the stories, like the fantasies, want some suggestion, like the erotic stories, and some like more explicit stories, like really more the visual stimulation. I think that's very individually dependent, yeah.
Did anyone think of a question that is really, really important at this moment? No? Then before I send you off and to go on and multiply, I think that's also the important
and
part
educate
of tonight.
And spread the word.
Engage. Practice. I would like to mention that if you are now really interested in this topic, that on 29th of November, Lumière, the cinema here, shows the film The Dilemma of Desire, which is a documentary that's also about the orgasm gap. But for now, please give her a warm applause, Marieke Dewitte.
Thank you.
And also an applause for all of you here in the room with us and who are watching from home, because I mean, it's quite amazing to talk about a topic that's such a taboo in a sense, in such an open and honest environment. So thank you very much. See you next time and have a great evening.
I was looking for the picture of Ellen, so thank you, Ellen, for giving us this knowledge. I think it's also important to honor her words, yeah.